Welcome back to our channel. Today, we want to shed some more light on the horrific conditions of enslaved pregnant women during the slave breeding era. You might have heard that the children of enslaved women were taken away from them almost immediately after birth. But most of us do not know the horrifying stories of these women during pregnancy and childbirth. Imagine a pregnant black woman who worked on a large plantation along with other enslaved people, and she's probably carrying her very first pregnancy. You would think her masters would excuse her until she delivered her baby and it was healthy enough to resume work. The realities instead were that pregnant enslaved women were subjected to the same arduous labor and dealt the same harsh treatment as any other slave on the plantation. In fact, they were made to return to work in a matter of days, and that's if she survives childbirth. They had no medical care at all. Enslaved pregnant women in those days were only at the mercy of other experienced enslaved women on slave breeding farms or plantations. In many cases, the child is taken away from the mother soon after it is weaned and sold off to other plantation owners. The story gets even more horrific on slave breeding farms, where enslaved women were forced to have countless sexual relationships with different men against their own wishes to breed more slaves for their owners. This practice was rampant in the predominantly agro-driven southern U.S. states in the late 18th century and into the 19th century. Slave breeding was a common practice of forcing enslaved black women to have children to increase their owners' wealth. It happened throughout the duration of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States. However, it intensified in the early 1800s, particularly after the end of the international slave trade in 1808. As a result, owners resorted to increasing their stock through forced breeding. The children born from this practice were often separated from their families and sold to other owners, further fueling the profitability of slavery. Slave breeding was further encouraged by laws that saw the objectification of slaves. They were seen as property rather than human beings and were treated as such. This inhumane practice continued until the end of the Civil War in 1865, when slavery was finally abolished in the United States. Enslaved black women were often brutally denied the basic right to care for their babies, leaving the women to suffer the severe emotional pain that follows after separation from their babies. Part of that experience was the heartbreaking fact that these women would never again set eyes on their children. Before we continue to unravel the tough realities of enslaved women during pregnancy, the childbirth, understand that we are just scratching the surface with all of this information. Back in 1619, when the privateer, the White Lion, brought 20 enslaved Africans ashore in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Slavery wasn't based on race. People were enslaved mostly because they were captured and sold off. But soon after that, as slavery continued to become profitable, some U.S. states passed laws to ensure that slaves remain enslaved for life, passing them from one generation to another or from one owner to another. They made sure that enslaved people had no rights. By the 1800s, slave breeding became the new method to perpetuate the slavery business, considering that the international slave trade had been abolished. Slave breeding farms were established on many plantations across America, particularly in the South. These slave breeding farms had only one purpose: to breed more slaves, and they employed every available tactic to make this happen. They selected enslaved black men who were perceived to have desirable physical traits and abilities to impregnate enslaved black women, and the children were separated and sold off soon after childbirth. One of these slave farms was owned by a very prominent and influential American statesman, Thomas Jefferson. Yes, it is the same Thomas Jefferson you know. Thomas Jefferson was an American founding father and the third president of the United States. He was one of the principal authors of the Declaration of Independence, which is considered to be one of the most important documents in American history. Jefferson's contributions to the United States extended beyond his presidency. However, Jefferson has also been criticized for his controversial views on slavery. The man owned a 5,000-acre working plantation and a slave farm, also known as Monticello in Virginia. where Jefferson kept over 600 enslaved black people to work for him. Many of the enslaved individuals who labored on his plantation were subjected to harsh working conditions and experienced substantial sexual mistreatment. Jefferson bred many slaves on his farm and saw nothing wrong in doing so. In fact, the man famously had a long-term, non-consensual sexual relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, with whom he had several children. Sally Hemings had at least 6 children fathered by Thomas Jefferson, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. But it will interest you to know that Jefferson's relationship with Hemings was a product of the institution of slavery, which allowed white slaveholders to exploit and use the bodies of their enslaved black people. This meant that Sally's children were also Jefferson's slaves and were not recognized as his children. But decades after negotiations, Jefferson freed all of Sally Hemings' children. But it wasn't just Thomas Jefferson who perpetuated this practice. Many in America also did. They saw enslaved black women as breeding machines to be used as they deemed fit. Another American founding father who shared the same ideology as Jefferson was Pierce Meese Butler. Butler saw nothing wrong in using enslaved women as breeders. Many slaveholders would buy young and able farmmen and well-developed young girls with fine physiques to barter and sell. William Ward, an enslaved black man in Georgia, who was interviewed by the WPA Slave Narrative Project in 1937, mentioned that they were raised and sold off like pigs on slave farms. In fact, young and pretty enslaved black women were often advertised for sale as good breeding stock. Throughout the history of slavery, several documents showed how slaveholders sexually exploited black people. Another notable example of this disturbing practice is the story of a woman named Mary Reynolds, who was enslaved on a tobacco plantation in Virginia in the early 1800s. Mary was born into slavery to the Kilpatrick family in Black River, Louisiana. When she was interviewed in 1937 by WPA Slave Narrative about her recollections of slavery, Mary narrated how many enslaved black women were forced to bear several children with men chosen by their owners, and each child was immediately taken away from their mother after birth. Physical and psychological abuse these women must have endured daily is difficult to fathom. Harriet Jacobs, who was enslaved in North Carolina, also wrote about her experience of being forced to have sexual relations with her owner and bear 2 children. Following maltreatment from her master's wife, Harriet ran away and hid in an attic in her grandmother's house for 7 years. There, she watched and nurtured her children as they grew. Her biography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, gives more insights into the anguish of being separated from her children, as well as the heart-wrenching situations of many pregnant enslaved women during her time. But the horrors didn't end there. Enslaved black women were subjected to horrific birthing practices and often denied any form of medical care during pregnancy. Some of these birthing practices exposed these women to infection and sometimes permanent injuries. In many cases, they were expected to deliver their babies in the OR in their living quarters, without any assistance from medical professionals. Many enslaved women were also subjected to medical experiments and were used as guinea pigs for doctors to practice their techniques on. This only added to the trauma of childbirth for enslaved women, leaving many of them with lifelong physical and emotional scars. It was only after the abolishment of slavery that birthing practices for black women began to improve. One notable procedure used on pregnant black slaves during childbirth was the breaking of the pelvis. Breaking of the pelvis during childbirth is a rare and complicated procedure that involves the expansion of the pelvic region during the delivery process. This is often used when the birth canal is too small or narrow and the baby cannot pass through, leading to complications. It is an excruciatingly painful procedure. No anesthesia was used on these women. Another barbaric childbirth system used on enslaved black women during this era was the birthing chair. The use of the birthing chair was one method of assisting labor and delivery and improving the chances of a safe birth for both mother and child. The birthing chair was designed to support and restrain the women in an upright position. This allowed gravity to assist in the childbirth process and minimize the discomfort of prolonged labor. Although there was very little documentation of this barbaric practice during the slave breeding era, Harriet Jacobs provided descriptions of the use of the birthing chair to restrain pregnant slaves during childbirth and the breaking of the pelvis procedure to facilitate childbirth. Perhaps the most graphic and heart-wrenching narrative of the barbaric childbirth practices used on enslaved black women during childbirth and pregnancy was the account of James Marion Sims. James Marion Sims was an American physician who was known as the father of modern gynecology. While his surgical techniques revolutionized the field of women's medicine, Sims' legacy is also highly controversial due to the unethical treatment of enslaved women that he used for his medical experiments. Considering that healthy enslaved black women were profitable as breeding stock for their white owners, they sometimes hired white doctors to assist the women in producing healthy offspring. One particular issue affecting many slave women at the time was vesicovaginal fistula. Vesicovaginal fistula is a condition that occurs when there is an abnormal opening between the bladder and the vagina, resulting in constant leakage of urine from the vagina. Vesicovaginal fistula caused severe physical discomfort, embarrassment, and social isolation for women who suffered from it. Share your thoughts and insights in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation and work towards a better understanding. Thank you for joining us in this journey. Subscribe to our channel, be part of our insightful discussions. We'd love to see you again.